I'm muted. You'd think I'd know by now. Anyway, it's great to see all of you here. Thrilled to have so many of you showing up. And we'll get started in just a moment. Welcome to Stats Virtual Event, JPM Recap Live. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm Matthew Herper, Senior Writer of Medicine and Editorial Director for Events here at Stat. And I'm sure you know how this whole thing works by now. There's been a whole pandemic. But before we get started, a few quick housekeeping items. The bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the Stat team. Please don't put your questions for Meg and I in the chat. Instead, and if you do have questions that you'd like to ask us, and we really hope you do, this will be a lot more fun, please use the Q&A feature to type your question, and we'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you would most like to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is what makes these events engaging and fun. We want to hear from you, and thanks again for being here. I just got back last night. I'm still totally loopy from JPM, so this is a great time to ask whatever you want. Before we get started, I would like to thank Amgen for sponsoring today's event. All right, well, welcome, Meg. There we go. Hi,
Sorry,
Meg.
it took me a minute to click all the buttons. Yeah, you'd think I would have known how to do this myself.
We've had a whole pandemic, but we've also had a whole JP Morgan.
I also had a whole maternity leave, so I have an extra 6 months of an excuse.
True, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
So what did a lot of life has happened since the last time we were at JP Morgan. So what did you think? You were back doing your up at the crack of dawn, interviewing every CEO for 2 days straight. What was your big takeaway from this meeting?
So my big takeaway may not be surprising to anyone else, but it's probably that, like, at least to this audience of people who was at the conference, COVID is not a thing anymore. There were like no masks. Nobody was worried about COVID at all. Nobody's really talking about COVID. There were a few companies that did have COVID stuff, like Regeneron as a next generation antibody. That sounds really interesting. But COVID is not a thing anymore. The pandemic is over, just like the president said. So that was news to me because I've been out on maternity leave for 6 months and I was wearing my mask religiously. And I've been testing every day since I came home, negative so far. But beside that point, I think everybody, of course, thinks about JP Morgan.
The death toll is also inching back up. So there's that.
Yeah. Also, it's technically not over, but I mean, the perception is that it is over. So aside from that, I think, the importance of this conference is that it kicks off the year for biotech and biopharma, and everybody always talks about it setting the stage or at least giving a gauge of where sentiment is. And so it was really interesting to kind of check in with people about how they were perceiving the vibe. And, I think it was sort of we're all happy to be back together, but it's not euphoric, it wasn't like there was some huge news to start the conference, some great data. It's not a huge data heavy conference usually anyway, or some super exciting corporate news. We didn't see some big M&A that got everybody excited. There was just sort of everything was fine. You know what I mean? And maybe that's okay because things have been so weird. It's fine for everything to be just fine.
I did think the news though was marginally negative. I mean, it was a pretty boring JP Morgan, but you had Illumina disappointing. You had, famous in the Regeneron story is the moment when they had Eylea sales and they were so far above what the street expected. Well, they came in low. We had a whole bunch of CEO replacements, including Novavax. I mean, this doesn't sound like happy times to me.
Yeah, I agree. I remember that JP Morgan where I think that happened with Len Schleifer, and the stock had been running up into it because one investor told me Len was going around the Westin St. Francis, grinning at everyone. And everybody knew the Eylea numbers must have been super good. But yeah, they missed. And Len says it was a one-off thing. I think some other people like Brian Scorney, who likes to tell the truth, or at least as he sees it, suggest there is potentially more competition. Len thinks it's not going to be more than this quarter for that. I think Illumina, it was funny. It's just Illumina is disappointing the street again at, in their earnings announcement. that's what they always do. If they didn't disappoint the street, the stock would like double, I think. I mean, and then they come.
I think that's accurate. And I
Not
also
earnings.
I think there's a large amount of disappointment there, right? Because go back to the previous CEO, Illumina never disappointed the street. So,
oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize there was a difference between Jay Flatley and Francis D'Souza in terms of maybe Francis D'Souza just doesn't care as much about the like quarterly things. I don't know, because there's a lot you can do with the numbers, right? And the accounting.
Well, it's also harder to it's a very different business now. It's a much more mature business. Like the market for research, they needed to buy new sequencers every year, and they needed the new Illumina machines, right? So now they're dealing with hospitals and things and medical research. And, the difference between when a genome was really expensive, that drop down was a lot more money. If you're already down to the hundreds of dollars, do you care if your genome costs 400 or 200? I don't know.
Really interesting point. So I wonder how much of it is the change in the business, which, as you say, has been dramatic over the last, I don't know, however long it has been since Jay Flatley was the CEO, but then also maybe different approaches to guidance, I don't know, and how they treat that with the street.
Yeah, I think that's all factoring in. Patty Eisenhower wants to know, what was your favorite interview during JPM and why? And if you guys want to tell me whether you want me to answer these too, go ahead.
I would like you to answer them too.
Well, yes, but what was your favorite interview of JP Morgan? I think we might get to our planned questions here with this one, but
I feel bad saying I had any preferences. I loved them all. But probably the one that I was Chris Viehbacher from Biogen. And the only reason I say that, I did very much enjoy all of my interviews to anybody who's watching from any of the other companies I spoke with. But it was the first time I got to talk with Chris Viehbacher, CEO of Biogen. I think, Matt, you were saying you were the only other person who has interviewed.
I believe it's just us so far. Yeah.
Yes. This is the club. This is a live stream for reporters who have interviewed Chris Viehbacher as the CEO of Biogen. But it was really interesting to hear from a person who I knew in such a different setting as the CEO of Sanofi. And actually, the reason I started covering biotech was because of his acquisition at Sanofi of Genzyme. Bloomberg, I was sort of like the number 2 pharma reporter under Shannon Pettypiece, who was covering Pfizer and all the big ones. And I was covering
she's been covering the White House. So this is.
I know. Yeah, she's covering the White House for NBC News now.
Yeah.
Actually, we're colleagues again in the same organization. And it's great because she'll be covering COVID stuff and she really gets it. And so she'll email me and we'll work together on things. It's really fun. But I moved over to cover biotech because of that deal. And I was covering the Genzyme side. So I knew Chris Viehbacher as sort of this, this figure ahead of this giant French company. And now to see him take charge of Biogen, I don't know. And what he said just really seemed one person close to Biogen sort of summed it up afterwards. And this person is very close to the company. Basically it was there's an adult in the room now. That was really interesting to hear, somebody who has so much experience and has a plan, has a path, and everything he said, just oh, it's really interesting. I didn't think of a lot of the things that he talked about. So I thought that was cool.
He's always had kind of a quiet swagger, right? He's a very, when he was running Sanofi, he's kind of hard to perturb.
I should try to perturb him and see.
Yeah, he's just very calm and kind of fast on his feet in a way that's rare. And I thought that came through in the presentation too. He was, he was very frank when he was first announced, and I talked to him about, there were a lot of challenges, but I wouldn't want a job where there weren't, right? So he's an interesting guy. Now, my favorite was Caleb, because I got to do that one on stage and talk to him for 35 minutes, I think. And favorite is kind of a weird word though, because it was kind of a tough interview to do, because there was a lot of stuff to ask him, and I was I know Adam told you he was a little surprised on the podcast. I was surprised. I just am surprised by not the level of support he has for the decision, but just some of the technical things there. It sounds like we will be getting more advisory committees, which is a bit of an admission that maybe maybe that with both the pandemic and this, that they haven't been listening to those enough. And also, I'm kind of fascinated that they pushed through a change to accelerated approval, which would probably have prevented this accelerated approval, which is that you have to have your confirmatory trial started. And he simply said that, well, that wasn't the rule before. So, but it's fun to do them on stage. Is one was my favorite.
Yeah. Well, so I interviewed him the next day on TV. And, I asked him how the event had gone, and he has tremendous amount of respect for you, which I knew from, you guys kind of go way back. Like, you wrote that story in Forbes calling the whole Sarepta decision and what happened around it, a civil war, I think, at FDA. And that was always a title he took great umbrage to.
I mean, Rob has been taking umbrage to my titles for 15 years. He didn't like any of the titles on the Vytorin stories, if people remember that Merck cholesterol drug, which was a long time ago. So,
yeah,
he, and at the last stat event, he complained about the headlines. He doesn't like headlines. He's very much a man of nuance, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, we've got a lot of questions.
I know, I'm seeing them come in fast and furious, and I'm relieved I'm not the moderator.
Yep, well, it's my job. Let's wait to get to another Illumina question. So a bunch, though, here about the current economy and how it will affect business plans and operations for pharma biotech. I'm reading that from Mary Catherine Devane, but I think I've seen a bunch. What's your take there, Meg? What do you think about how the current economy is affecting biotech and pharma?
Well, I think one element of the economy more broadly that I've seen people talk about in relation to biotech is inflation, and the fact that drug companies often try to use inflation as the benchmark, against which they'll raise prices of their medicines. And because inflation has been so high, I saw one note speculating that could enable drug companies to raise prices more and still be in line with inflation. We'll see whether that actually happens. I did think there was a really interesting point in Brian Abrams's, summary note of, just came out today. He's from RBC Capital Markets, talking about sort of the 10 big biotech themes out of the last week. And he mentioned drug price increases are coming in strong. He's like, we did not see a slowdown in the annual price increases. Many products took their usual hikes. He said, this may be a scramble for maximizing value ahead of expected price cuts due to the Inflation Reduction Act, which I thought was just really interesting. If, these companies are preparing to potentially have their prices cut, of course, they're like ramping up the increases as much as they can without attracting Bernie Sanders and other people's attention before then.
Yeah, no. I think one thing that's important to remember here is that for the large pharmaceutical companies and for biotech, the environment can have very different effects. Like for some companies like Merck and to some degree Sanofi, like the argument for buying the stock is that they're going to be very resistant to a bad economy. They could become seen as safety stocks. So I think it could be a lot tougher on small biotechs, particularly if the financing windows don't start to open up again. Because on the other hand, we spoke to Jason Kelly from Ginkgo, which is the synthetic biology company, which is really like a lot of the companies that went public through SPACs. The stock's really just been hit very, very hard. But his point was that he has 1.3 billion, and his job is not to spend it all before money starts coming in. So it'll be interesting to see how people wade through the winter. Minion Weiss says that coming off a tough year for biotech, I do think the flurry of small yet bolt-on deals are exciting to see. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think people agree with that. I think it's not quite as exciting as a giant deal of when Seattle Genetics or Seagen was supposed to be acquired, and a deal of that size. But it does seem like it's much more likely that deals of the $1 to $5 billion range that people love to call bolt-ons, probably the ones we're going to continue to keep seeing. And those do, I think, support valuations in biotech if they do keep happening, because that represents an exit for investors.
I think it's really interesting to think about whether we will get any bigger deals, though. I mean, I spoke to Pfizer, and Michael Dolston there was very much talking about how they had de-emphasized a lot of gene therapy programs because they've decided they need bigger products. It's kind of like Pfizer is back to being the Pfizer we were used to for years, that wants blockbusters, right? And I spoke to Giovanni Caforio, and he from Bristol, and he was talking about bolt-on about deals, but he was also saying that they have a lot of financial flexibility because they've paid off debt. Do you think we're going to get a bigger deal at some point? I mean, do you think anybody's, because so far nobody's really pulled the trigger on anything dramatic.
Yeah, I think we will. I mean, I don't know when, but
Yeah,
probably will get at least one giant one.
people always say they're not buying anything until they are, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Okay, well, several questions here. Any major policy concerns? The price negotiations under the Inflation Reduction Act, FDA reforms, from Benedict Callan. Let's talk about the IRA, Meg. What's your take from companies about how big an effect the IRA will have?
Well, I think the majority of the people I spoke with think it is a big deal. And, Vosner Simon was one, the CEO of Novartis, who's also the incoming chair of PhRMA, the industry lobbying group. And he talked about the fact that, there is a very real situation where companies are thinking about how the different time periods to price negotiations for small molecules versus biologics actually makes a difference in how they think about developing medicines. I mean, I think we saw an announcement from Eli Lilly de-emphasizing a Loxo oncology drug, citing that specific situation. I think that it's maybe like 9 years for small molecules and 13 years for biologics. And so, he was saying that makes a really big difference when they're thinking about where to invest. But we had Len Schleifer on from Regeneron, who was like, that's a bunch of BS. We get a couple of nuggets of innovation every few years. We have to take anything we can get and go with it based on where the science is leading. We cannot be so cavalier as to say we're not going to do this because of, this price situation, which I thought was really interesting. And it's always fun to get Len's take on that stuff.
I mean, Len's always fun. I think it's a case of both are true, though. I mean, Giovanni at Bristol gave me a good example of a cancer drug where they are absolutely pursuing the cancer drug, but they're not doing the first line study because those take 10 years in multiple myeloma, right? So I do think we're going to see a lot of impacts on the margins, and it definitely has some impact, especially when these big pharma guys are kind of managing where they put their early stage money. I feel like I heard a lot of people saying, well, it's going to have a big impact, but not for me. And sometimes for the reason that they're already in biologics, right?
Yeah. Right. I mean, Len's in a pretty good position because they're more in biologics. But I think it's kind of sad to think about that, though. There was, I presume if there was something incredibly promising, a company wouldn't not pursue it because of this. But it's still, it's sort of like if it could make a difference to treating cancer, then it's sad if it's not being pursued, obviously.
Right. But I guess to Len's point, a lot of drugs are not incredibly promising, especially by the time they get to market. A lot of them are incremental. So I think it is likely to affect those it's going to affect those assets, right? It's slightly better maybe. And innovation does happen that way too. I mean, the other thing though is that the Inflation Reduction Act could mean that if you have a product that has trouble going through the Medicare donut hole, that it gets paid for more. It's not like it's just taking away. It could increase volume.
That's true. You don't hear a whole lot about the things the drug industry gets from this, though, from the drug industry anyway.
Yeah, I guess people may have talked to me more about it because they were in like long interviews where they weren't sure they were. Yeah, but I did hear that a few times that there is this upside, and then that the small molecule thing is terrible and they hope to change it.
Yeah, I would like to understand how they came to the small molecule versus the biologics difference, Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't have a great understanding of it. It does seem to have something to do, my impression is it has something to do with making the bill pay for itself, right? Like it saves money. And it had to do also with the the extensions that were already, the protections that are already on biologics, that they couldn't lower those more.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it had to do with the fact that the Democrats had to vote for this, and this was a technical detail, and it was in the bill. And I think the chances of getting it out, even if it was a bad idea, were very low just because of the way law is made, right?
I heard that exact same thing, and I wonder if we heard it from the same person.
Yeah. Backing off on the star power and charismatic leaders, were there any important technology breakthroughs? Chris Dwan wants to ask.
Typically I don't think you hear a lot about data updates at the conference, but it was interesting to talk with different companies about what they're most excited about in their own pipelines. I asked Len Schleifer from Regeneron what he thought the most exciting science going on in medicine was right now. And he talked about the technology developed by his partner, George Yancopoulos, to turn cold tumors to hot tumors, essentially using, I think, bispecific antibodies. And he talked about some early stage results in, I believe they had prostate cancer results. Is that right for Regeneron? Not at the meeting, but like before the meeting in technology. So he's really excited about that. It was also really exciting to talk with Stefan Bancel from Moderna about their personalized cancer vaccine data. That just seems like suddenly we're starting to see this whole space open up in terms of the promise there, which has been talked about for so long. But he also talked about how ultimately, way down the line, you could see pairing liquid biopsy, so blood tests for cancer, with personalized cancer vaccine sort of treatment. So you just put those two things together and this is way down the line, but it's just really cool to hear how these folks in the industry think about, what's really, really exciting right now.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Matt?
Again, it's not a meeting for technology, although Illumina used to launch their new sequencers. It used to be a pretty good news story. There generally just wasn't news. For those of us who are sitting around writing news stories, in between meetings, there was a lot of, someone said something kind of interesting, but there wasn't a lot of, there's a new anything. BioMarin had some interesting data on what their next gen gene therapies might look like. But I think that was cool and kind of incremental, that they think they can. I think everybody wants to know about the current one and when we'll hit the market at this point.
Regeneron talked about their next generation COVID antibody.
Right.
They apparently found this 1 in a million molecule, or antibody, which is the way Len described it, which should stand up better against future variants, because perhaps it binds in a place that won't change so much. Of course, we'll have to see, because this virus has mutated so quickly. It has definitely gotten around everything in terms of antibodies that we've thrown at it so far, including the cocktail from Regeneron.
Yeah, we heard that from Vir before, right? They were super confident that antibody was going to be resistant to new variants, and it was until it wasn't.
Right.
So I have been surprised that we haven't gotten new antibodies faster, that we haven't been able to keep up with the variants.
I think it's
a regulatory and company problem, but
what's that?
I think that's both a regulatory and company problem.
Yeah, me too. I think it's less about the science, possibly, and more about the fact that companies didn't see the market materializing to really take advantage of these antibody drugs. Florida figured it out when they wanted to resist the vaccine. In some ways, Ron DeSantis focused on antibodies instead of focusing really on vaccines, but figured it out, was giving away these antibodies in public libraries. We didn't see that happen on a national basis. And I think, was it you who interviewed Len about just like the incredible frustration about this, Len or George? They've been so frustrated that the antibodies weren't.
Jason, yeah. Well, I have too. He's been frustrated the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was.
And so I was actually kind of surprised to come back from maternity leave and come to this conference and see that Regeneron was talking about a next generation COVID antibody, because the last I talked to them about it, which was the spring of 2022, so about a year ago, they were basically like, yeah, we've got more. We can take them through the initial stages of testing. but we're not going to pull the trigger on trying to chase this thing until we really know, what we need to be developing. And so I didn't even realize that this was their strategy, but then maybe in that time period, they found this thing and they, started developing it. But it just seemed like the companies were sort of like, this isn't going to work, like regulatorily or market wise.
Raphael Rousseau wants to ask, it seemed that the prospect of short-term IPOs was the driver for VC to invest in new companies before the 2022 market crash. Many VCs seem in disarray with bad returns. What does fundraising look like for new startups moving forward, and any hint from JPM stages and corridors?
That's a good question. That wasn't really as much my focus while I was there. Man, get a sense of that?
I did. So, there are two things. One of the most fun discussions I had was with Bob Nelson, the VC. But he's not, because it was at like 9 p.m. and he was already kind of hosting a cadre of people over a bottle of very old wine. But he's always a bad answer for this, right? Because Bob always thinks he can raise umpty $1 billion for whatever his new biggest startup ever is going to be.
Well, Bob always can.
Bob always can. In fact, we saw with Altos, right? $3 billion is a lot of money and a lot of runway. I think that it is kind of feast or famine. I think that there are things that still will get big chunks of money if people are really excited about them. But I think it's going to be hard, and I'm interested how that works with, for instance, Pfizer spinning off the old array chemistry business. I did have someone tell me that they think that the IPO market is going to be different depending on the things we'll get through, and things will get through at a good valuation if there's a product and it's really clear why you should buy it. But a lot of the speculative stuff that's been able to get out over the past few years won't. And I think the VCs are paying attention to that. And I do expect decreases in VC investment.
Yeah, that tracks with sort of my general vibe on it, which is not very helpful to people to hear my general vibe. I do wonder how much we're going to see increased interest in the sort of darling areas right now of drug development, which is funny to say because these have been so out of favor for so long. But I would say the obesity and diabetes space with these new weight loss drugs that everybody's so into, and then Alzheimer's. These are like two spaces that investors are incredibly excited about in the big pharma, big biotech space. And I wonder how much sort of approaches in those areas will be more attractive than other areas that have, sort of all this time been in vogue.
They're going to be hard though, aren't they? Because those are both areas. Alnylam, we're expecting Alzheimer's data pretty soon, and that'll be interesting. But for small companies, they're hard areas to get into. They're very expensive trials to run.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
One of the things.
I wonder, does that lead to less, fewer small companies started up in those spaces? But all ideas somehow have to get to the big companies, they don't always come from the big companies. So
it probably means they have to sell earlier, which probably hurts valuation. Like it could be different.
It could, but at the same time, because they're hot areas, that might help their valuations.
I'm sure. Oh, wow. We have a question from Lisa Suennen. Hi, Lisa. Lisa wants to know if there's anything notable on the medical device front from this year's meeting.
I wasn't as focused on the medical device front.
I have a funny answer, which is
You have a funny answer?
Yeah, I sat down with Mike Musselem at Edwards Life Sciences.
Oh yeah, he's retiring this year, right?
That was why I sat down with him, and that was my note. They have some cool new stuff coming through, but this just seemed like a good opportunity to say, it was really nice to sit down with Mike and to kind of just talk about, he is planning to do a lot of philanthropy next, which I think is interesting. Really an amazing, if anybody remembers the video of Mick Jagger dancing like the day after his heart valve procedure, the guys really did do something pretty impressive. So, well,
and I'd also ask Lisa if what she thought was interesting, because her opinion is much more informed than mine.
Lisa, if you want to plug anything into the chat, we'll read it. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Let's see, what else do we got here? got a bunch of smaller. Any other company? Joseph Katakowski asks, any other companies planning on bowing out of pharma or bio, a la AbbVie? What was the consensus on how companies viewed groups like these might become more or less relevant in the future, or other groups take their place due to perceived failures toward the IRA?
Who got pharma and bio?
AbbVie did. AbbVie left pharma. No.
The sorry, the industry groups. I was reading it. I was like, they left the
meeting.
What is AbbVie considered now?
Yeah, no, they still are. I mean, Len's an interesting example, right? Because I'm not sure Regeneron belongs to either of them still. For years, they didn't. I don't really know what is going to happen. I think there is a feeling that both groups stumbled some this year. Bio was obviously a big mess, like going through a bad management transition and eventually firing your CEO while this new legislation is passing is not ideal.
Yeah, I saw those headlines. I was on leave and I was like, oh man, like I was getting news alerts from the Wall Street Journal. So
right.
I was surprised it led to that level.
So, I mean, that's not good. I don't know that there's anything those groups could have really done to cushion the IRA at this point. I think that I think they did sort of have to have a seat at the table. And I think that they'd probably disagree, but I don't think that there's they could just have prevented this or stalled it at some point. I think once Manchin was willing to do it, it was going to happen. And it also was going to happen quickly. And one of the problems I think we have in healthcare is all these bills come through at the last minute on one vote. I mean, we saw it with Obamacare too, and it's not a good way to write legislation. And so the legislation's always a mess.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've ever seen a good way of writing legislation actually be put into practice, with at least in my lifetime. But
well, but having typos in the bill because you can't review it is definitely the worst, which happened with Obamacare. Mm-hmm. So you don't get don't get discussion on these finer points when it's past something now or it's never going to get through.
Right.
So the division kind of hurts us there. Let's see the sentiment on any thoughts from Nick Van Terheyden about the differential pricing we see between the US and everywhere else does not seem sustainable in the current headwinds of resistance?
I'll be interested to see if that changes. I wouldn't expect it to. I mean, my default position about all of this has just been like, this is the way things are and nothing ever changes in terms of the US pricing environment relative to other places. But the IRA did offer a small change in that situation. And so, we're going to start to see what drugs they try to negotiate and how big of discounts we actually see try to be taken there. So that may change things to some degree, but you also hear from companies how important the US market is to them because they make so much of their money here versus other countries. And if that changes substantially, are they going to start cutting back in other ways on research in the ways that they've been threatening? We'll see if that actually happens. Yeah. What do you think?
I wrote my first story saying the drug prices are really different overseas 20 years ago. There hasn't been a big shift, so this can obviously continue a long time. I do think the IRA is a sign of some change. And I think we'll see it slowly have an effect. I think a lot of that law is going to depend on how it's put into practice, which is where the lobbying is going to get pretty hot and heavy again. But it's always an overhang, and it's an interesting situation to be so dependent on drug pricing levels in the US. On the other hand, there aren't any systemic changes to the US system to fix all the issues that lead drug prices to be so high here. I don't think the IRA alone does that. I think the fragmented nature of the system means that people can continue to find somebody to pay that price.
And to pay the price, and also the whole idea that there's the price that is set of drugs goes to so many different entities, the
right,
and all of that stuff to get formulated.
Getting paid, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, on some fundamental level, our payer system, our insurance system, when other countries put in place systems that do try to conserve costs, sometimes too much, we didn't. And we have these fragmented insurance companies who don't seem very good at managing cost versus benefit. So I think until you can fix that system, I don't know how you really get a complete handle on drug prices here. But I do think people are going to be trying, and that's going to mean there's going to be change.
Yeah. I will say, as somebody who's used a lot more healthcare in the last year than I normally do because I had a baby, looking at the itemization from my hospital stay, I kind of like saw what all the drug industry people are complaining about.
Oh, yeah.
The focus on medicines. Of course, the medicines that I used, I think all of them were generic. So they were like $3 before reimbursement, in my insurance. Whereas like my hotel room, my hospital room was like thousands of dollars. And like all of these things were thousands of dollars. And like my drugs were like $3. This is very different when, from talking about a novel cancer medicine, obviously, where people can be paying a lot out of pocket, or the new Alzheimer's drugs, for example. But I did, as a sort of, a typical way to use the healthcare system, the drugs were such a tiny part of it.
But the Alzheimer's drugs are infused, and with cancer drugs, the hospitals make a pretty big premium too. And yeah, it is kind of scary that having a baby is such a financially expensive experience, since it's something that so many of us want to do, and that you kind of need to have a society, right?
Yeah, we want it to continue.
Yeah. And babies are awesome. So speaking of that, you tweeted something I thought was really interesting, which is you tweeted about being a nursing mother at JP Morgan. And you had something that kind of blew my mind as someone whose kids are teenagers, which is that you were mailing your breast milk back, that there's a service to do that now. What does that cost? Tell me about that. I'm just kind of mind blown.
Yeah, there are these great companies that have been set up to serve this market, and they really understand what traveling parents need in these situations. I mean, they ship things to you overnight, so you get exactly, Kara, Milk Stork. That's what I used. So I'm seeing the chat. So Milk Stork is the name of this company. It's not cheap. I mean, depending on how much you need to ship, it's hundreds of dollars. I think mine turned out to be something like $500. Milk Stork does work with companies to reimburse for that. So that can be really nice. But yeah, I had like a whole system set up, and I was walking through those crowded, full of 99%, male corridors with a box full of breast milk. So you haven't lived till you've done that at JP Morgan. But they did have a FedEx run on site, which I very much appreciated.
I had a nice dinner with several women VCs, and it was really a nice difference from the normal JP Morgan vibe.
Yeah, but it's sad that was like a unique experience for you, and it is for me too. I remember the conversations I have with women at JP Morgan because they're so infrequent and so enjoyable.
Right. No, I completely.
Like Kristen Peck from Zoetis, lovely. And we've been like exchanging emails since then. Not that everybody else wasn't lovely too. Lovely.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I got to see Cami Samuels, it's definitely a different vibe. It can feel like a bunch of guys at the frat house, and it's not the best. Mary Doyle asked if there's any update at the meeting RE Digital Medicine. I thought that would be a good time to throw in. It wasn't technically at JP Morgan, but I thought the Verily news was interesting. A pretty big shift with a lot of the faces that we've been used to seeing at that company leaving, and A.B. Abernethy taking a higher role, and the new CEO, who seems like a really interesting guy, football player, really setting some kind of a new direction there. That's interesting. Did you have any digital experiences, or you probably were mostly focused on pharma?
It was, but one thing that touched the digital space was the idea that it will be so incredibly helpful for improving screening and potential, diagnosis or early flagging of problems with dementia, for example. There could be really helpful tools to move that whole thing earlier into, if you could have digital health tools that could be as part of a primary care checkup every year, starting at age 50 or whatever, then over time you can track how you're doing on some kind of digital health metric, and that could really help. You could also move that into the home in some ways for better screening and diagnosis, and so that was pretty exciting to hear about too.
Few of these seem worth reading, but they're not really questions. Sanofi and J&J lost out to Amgen in the Horizon acquisition, so what will they do now? I don't know that we need to answer that, but yeah.
Good question. Maybe buy something else, probably. I mean, I think that does signal they're ready to spend, and that's the kind of thing they're interested in.
I don't think that anyone has ever lost figuring that J&J would buy something.
Yeah.
It kind of is what that shark is built to do.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see under Joaquin Duato. So they've got new leadership. I think I saw somebody talking either in the chat or the Q&A about Joaquin and his vibe at the conference. So that was kind of interesting.
They're also doing a pretty big deal as it is with the Biomed acquisition. So that may hold them up for a bit, but they also have a lot of dry powder. It seemed like reactions to life science and the presentations were broadly positive, despite few companies providing detailed comments for 2023. And those that did, mostly talking in terms of ex-COVID or core growth. Anything you make of this? I don't. I think that's just people want to hear about core growth. I do think companies are still getting relatively little credit for COVID, even though it's permanent, because people aren't sure what the market's going to look like in 3 years.
I agree.
And then let's do something a little more fun, because it is actually the thing people most want to hear about. If JPM won't relocate this event to a site like Miami with better infrastructure, is there a competitor who could launch a competing event?
I think as long as JP Morgan is JP Morgan in January, it's going to be the marquee event. I do wonder, though, if they move to Miami or really anywhere else, does it lose some of that that luster in terms of that like pedigree of like it's been H&Q, it's been this in this exact space for 41 years. What do you think, Matt?
They have to be concerned about that, but it's also becoming so difficult. And something that strikes me as someone who plans events is that they're leaving a lot of money on the table by having all these other things happen, by having Biotech Showcase, by having all our event, all the events that happened, which I think would still happen if you gathered that kind of a crowd. But if they had more space, they might be able to have tiers of membership. I don't know how much. My impression is also when the JP Morgan doesn't really care because they really make money here off banking, not off this big event. But I do wonder if they are moving to a place like Miami, if they do try to grab bigger pieces of that pie or not.
How would they do that?
You would have to, if you had more rooms, you could have more people and you could have something aside from the main investor presentations. You could have more tracks.
Would it start to look like the HLTH health conference? That is so massive. Like
it really, I mean,
like, I don't know what to go to.
would probably have more content, right? Because there are all these, there are other conferences where companies who can't get on stage at JP Morgan are presenting kind of alongside and doing basically investor presentations.
Yeah.
So they really could make it even bigger in that way. But you also kind of want to bring that whole ecosystem with you because that's what makes it so huge, is that everyone goes and does their business development there. I don't know that any of the people coming to do business development at JP Morgan have any regrets would have any regrets at all about doing it in Miami instead. I think that just sounds so much easier.
Yeah. I mean, and who doesn't want to go to Florida in January? I do.
I like San Francisco in January, but I don't like San Francisco at JP Morgan. It kind of ruins the whole vibe. Whereas I think Miami will still be Miami. So, do I really think there's bandwidth for more companies? Not for my brain, but I think that there are enough people there that there probably is. So yeah. Wow, there are so many amazing questions here.
That's great.
Past popular discussion topics at JPM seemed absent this year, like pandemic preparedness, of ways of working, hybrid working models, and best practices. Did this come up in your discussions at all, or have we all moved on? I didn't hear a thing about it, even from people who had COVID.
People what?
Even from people who had just had COVID.
Oh, yeah. I think for the most part, most companies were acting like they'd moved on, despite, aside from the companies still working on COVID solutions. But even the way they talked about those medicines, like Schleifer, for example, talking about the next generation antibody, there wasn't the, we have to immediately get it approved and out there type of urgency to it. I mean, he did talk about the fact that there is still urgency, but that this is going to be a long-term problem. But people aren't talking about it like a pandemic in terms of preparedness and solutions like hybrid working and things like that, which is sort of funny because we're in a changed world. The world's not the way it was in 2020 before this started. It's different. I mean, I'm home right now. I don't know if you're.
One thing so am I. I'm in my, this is not actually the stat newsroom. I'm in my basement. One of the things that did strike me though is this was actually Giovanni again. So I guess there were some interesting things he said, was that he thought that their clinical trials process had gotten a lot faster from having to go through having to keep the trials going while remote, that all of those kinds of muscles remain and made them make changes that sped things up. And I know that in terms of working, I feel like we work a lot better remote than we did before. So I do feel like it probably has had some lasting impacts. I got the feeling at JP Morgan, nobody wanted to talk about it. Kind of like the fact that only a small handful of people seem to be masking it all. So, I think there was like a vibe of pretending that the whole thing had never happened.
Yeah. Or, I actually asked a couple people their psychology of not masking because I was masking and I, for every instant, like I could, I was masking and I'm still worried about getting COVID and basically giving it to my 6-month-old who hasn't been able to get fully vaccinated yet. Oh, thanks, Alex. I'm glad to hear that. Alex says they were masking too. I appreciate that. But they basically told me it wasn't that they didn't think they could get COVID. It was that they were, vaccinated up to as many times as they could. And Sarah kept your mask on the whole time as well. Okay. And all right, Julie too. All right. Okay, cool. I've got some people here, some friends. But that they felt like if they got COVID, it was going to be a sniffle and they weren't worried about it. And so that was a perspective, like it was good for me to hear. I was really like, I wanted to know.
I could confirm that Alex and Sarah were wearing masks when I saw them at JP Morgan. So, yeah, I mean, I'm usually very rigorous about masking. I felt like not doing it was a risk, but I also tend to think in terms of cost benefit. And I wasn't at the Westin. I would have masked at the Westin, but on stage at my own event.
Oh.
And then like
on television.
We had a dinner that was in a crowded space, but when you're having dinner with people, like you're really taking that risk. And then I haven't been masking for a while in one-on-one interviews because I feel like the benefit outweighs the risk. Whereas I don't think the subway is a huge risk for catching COVID, but I also don't understand why people don't mask on it. Because like, what are you going to miss? Some wonderful smell? I mean, it's nicer to have a mask on the.
I honestly felt the same way, Matt. Not about like the smell, but like when I got home to Newark and I came out of the airport, I was like, I could take my mask off now while I'm outside, like waiting for my Uber or whatever I was taking home. But it was cold. And so it's kind of nice to keep your mask on.
Yeah. So, I mean, but I think there was a lot of, well, I'm here and there's no way I can do JP Morgan without this amount of risk anyway. And at that point, putting on the mask for like that one party just doesn't seem smart. So I think or doesn't seem reasonable. So I think that is something that affected all of us. Someone asked PBMs critically get unmentioned. I think we've mentioned them in passing a couple times. Julie Ames, obviously a really critical part of the system that has a lot of issues with them. And I think we are running out of time. There was one question here I did want to get to from early on, or two. One you can't answer, Meg, which is, besides the stat event, which was the best party?
Oh yeah, I didn't go to any parties.
Yeah, I only went to a couple myself, so I actually can't. I enjoyed all of them.
Sounds like you went to Bob Nelson's very exclusive Monday night gathering.
Yes, that was interesting, but Bob did not have his party.
Oh yeah, because usually he starts it at like 10 o'clock on Monday night, and I'm like, I can't go to this. That's like 1 a.m. East Coast time, and I work East Coast hours at JP Morgan.
Yes. Usually has been one of my more productive parties over the years, but that was just a bunch of people in the back of the restaurant. What was funny was it was a madhouse in the front, and then it was this quiet zone, and it was very chill. But it was interesting that when I got there, he was holding court. Something I really wanted to read was this comment from Christiana Tran, which is, "Welcome back, Meg. Missed your energy with the boys, with the Z. So glad you're back on the Read Out Loud." And I think we're all really happy to have Meg back. So thanks for also doing this. It's fun to see.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm so happy to be back. I love those guys, and I love you, Matt. So I'm happy to be back here with everybody.
All right. And I think with that, we're a bit over time. So let's just give one more scroll here. See if there's any.
I'm really impressed by the engagement and everybody participating in this. This is fantastic. You guys do great.
Well, here's a good comment to read. "They're delusional, Meg. I know lots of friends and colleagues who've had a rough time with COVID. I'm fully vaxxed and boosted and contracted COVID for the first time, hopefully on a business trip where nobody masked." Yeah, I kind of share that same concern, and we'll see what happens over the next few days. I definitely kind of plan on masking more the next time I do something like this, not less. Any discussions with ARPA H? Did you catch Bob Califf's discussion with the new ARPA H head on stage, Meg? I didn't.
No, but that sounds really interesting. I'm sad I missed it.
Yeah, so there was, and neither of us saw it because JPM is like that. I don't know anyone else who got it too. Let's see. Any insights on cell and gene therapies as a business proposition? Asked Maura Knight. So much great progress in this field from an innovation standpoint, and I'm curious to hear how large pharmas are discussing the business opportunity.
Yeah, I talked to a few of them about it, the ones who are already in it, really. But, I think one of the questions I had was what the capacity is like right now, because we've seen, I think, for Bristol Myers, some manufacturing issues. And I think they may have been tied to the viral vectors. There's sort of a shortage of those. But it maybe sounds like that situation is getting better. For Novartis, it doesn't sound like that was an issue. I think in some situations, doing things in-house more was either a reaction to that or something they're trying to do more of anyway to ensure that they have better continuity there and better capacity. They're not doing everything in-house in general, but I think that is something that's happening. So I think the companies that are already in it are very, very, excited about it and feel like it's a strong area.
Gilead really emphasized to me that they are not having any supply problems, which is fairly impressive. And in the CD19 space, it really does feel to me like the new data is going to mean that the Gilead and Bristol will really be going at it, with Bristol's advantage really being around the lack of neurotox. That's what they talk about a lot, that their product doesn't cause as many brain issues. They seem less worried about J&J and Legend than they were before. So that'll be interesting. I do kind of feel like Novartis in that space has kind of fallen off because they didn't get that second line result that the others did. All right. Well, there are so many great questions here. And just thanks to all of you for showing up. It's really fun to do these when there are all these questions and all these people. We are running out of time. which really bums me out because I want to hang out with Meg for another hour. But that is where it is. So I just want to close out by thanking Meg and for answering so many really great questions from our audience. Thanks to our event sponsor, Amgen, and to all of you out there for taking time to join us. While I have you all here, I want to let you know that the annual Stat Madness competition launches in March, but nominations are due in January 17th. Stat Madness identifies the top discoveries in biomedicine. We select 64 nominations based on originality, scientific rigor, potential impact to go head-to-head in a fun March Madness-style bracket contest, including a live panel at our Breakthrough Summit in May. You can submit your nomination now at statnews.com/madness. And also, there's the Breakthrough Summit coming up, and we'll have a bunch more live events as the world does go back to doing more stuff in person. I look forward to seeing all of you out there and to hearing from people about our stories and about these events. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like. It was wonderful to see you and to see all these messages and questions. Thank you so much.